urge to be a nice girl really affects how women do conflict resolution. I talked with Dr. Sue Edwards at Dallas Seminary about how women can be nice but still resolve conflict in healthy ways. She's offering 4 separate presentations. She starts off with some general principles for healthy conflict resolution.
I'm Dr. Sue Edwards, and I, with Kelly Matthews, have written a book entitled Leading Women Who Wound. And we have learned that, well, you just have to get ready for conflict because it's coming. What do we do? Well, first of all, we have to understand that we as women often, because we've been trained to be nice, often we come at this in a manipulative, indirect, we can be mean-spirited with unkind barbs, sometimes even sugar-coated. And we don't do what Jesus told us to do, which is to be direct. Matthew 18, 15 through 17, Jesus is very clear. He says to us, go to that other sister, sit down with her, and have a meaningful, clarifying conversation. I find that most of conflict, about 90% of it, maybe 95% of it, is simply misunderstanding. And so we have to be courageous enough to sit down and actually have that conversation when we disagree and work through it. If we can't work through it, then we draw in another woman that both of us trust. And by the way, we have to work together on this and not try to one-up the other, but make it fair and kind all the way through. And then we talk with that third party there. If we can't work that out, then we go to the leadership of the church and we abide by what they tell us. There are other things we have to remember. One of them is to know ourselves well, to identify, are we a people pleaser or are we a bulldog? We have a whole chapter about those 2 characteristics that really can get us into trouble. And we have to learn to practice these skills. We're not going to suddenly, in our big conflict that is going to have great, very serious ramifications, know how to do this. We've got to practice this in our personal lives, in our working relationships, with our families, so that when conflict comes, and it will, we know what to do.
As we continued talking, Sue shared some of her own personal stories, one particular, about how conflict can really be painful and what she learned about the process of resolving it with women.
I came to faith in my mid-20s through a women's Bible study. These women took me in. I'd come from a very pagan, dysfunctional background. They took me in, they remothered me, they taught me how to pray and how to study the Bible and skills, leading small groups and teaching the Bible, but they never taught me anything about conflict, and particularly with other women. And so about, 10 years into ministry, I was a director of a large church women's ministry, and a woman there, another Bible study teacher, charged me with false teaching and tried to have me kicked out of the church. Well, I was absolutely astounded. And this went on for about a year, and it was so painful. But I learned tons about myself, about the conflict resolution process. I think what I learned most of all was that I was not prepared. I learned I was a people pleaser, that I cared more about what other people thought of me, and I wasn't performing for an audience of one, which was the Lord. And it sent me on a quest to understand how women do conflict and this whole area of what does conflict mean for women today. Because this area takes women out of ministry more than anything else. And the ocean of tears that have been shed over women and conflict, especially with other women, can hardly be measured.
Conflict can really take women out. You know, as Sue talked, I thought that was a very sobering statement. And it made me think about a time when a friend of mine, a girl, approached me about how I was like way too much in the spotlight. I probably needed to heed her comments, but I have to admit I didn't handle it very well. When we went on talking, Sue talked about the differences between how men and women handle conflict. Let's take a look at that. Sue, I'd love for you to talk with us about how women and men perceive conflict and conflict resolution maybe a little bit differently.
Well, the research backs that up. In fact, Dr. Janet Lever did a very interesting study about men and women. Actually, she studied boys and girls first, and she went to elementary school playgrounds and she watched little boys, and what she found, and little girls, and what she found was that little boys fight physically 20 times more. But they come back the very next day, and often they are better friends. In fact, it almost serves as this bonding mechanism. However, she watched when the little girls fought. They didn't fight as often, but when they did, oh my goodness, it was passive, it was aggressive, it was mean-spirited, and she watched them as they came back the next day, and they weren't friends. In fact, they carried on these games, they were unkind to each other, they formed little coalitions trying to get other girls to be mean to that little girl, and often it went on for weeks and even months. And what we find is that these tendencies, it's not true for all women, of course, but for many women, these tendencies are the same with adult men and women. So you can be in a meeting with men and women. This could be in the church, it could be in a business setting, even in our personal relationships, and you find that the men can focus on the topic that they're disagreeing on. And they can get a little bit heated, and it can get competitive, and then afterwards they just go out and have fun. They go have lunch or they play golf. But first of all, the women back down and don't participate in that kind of conversation because we're taught to be nice, and women who are nice don't act like that. And then we find in about a nanosecond, those women take it beyond the topic. So pretty soon it's not that we disagree just over this issue, but you don't like my hair, my child, or my pie.
We've made it personal.
And yes, we've made it very personal very, very quickly. And then often when we go into that conflict, we take all those identity issues, that personal part of it, and it makes it extremely difficult for us to resolve it biblically.
Even when we understand our fighting tendencies as women, there are still other issues to work through. Sue now discusses what to do when we deal with unhealthy people versus healthy people in conflict resolution.
It's very helpful to remember that conflict is getting worse today. If we look out at our culture, we find that people are becoming more and more mean-spirited. And they do that in areas where they feel deeply. So we find it in politics, and we also find it in faith or in religion. And what's happening in the culture bleeds into the church. Well, it's true, it's getting worse, but I think it's also helpful to realize that constructive conflict and destructive conflict are quite different. We're all going to deal with constructive criticism, and we need to take that well and learn from it, but we also need to know how to discern whether the conflict is going to be destructive to ourselves in the ministry. And that question is, does it come from a healthy person or a sick person? And there are sick people in the ministry. But Jesus set an example for us. I think it's so interesting when you think about that he chose the 12, and among them was a very difficult person. And did Jesus know that? Absolutely. Did he allow it? He did. And when he went to the cross, we know that that person, Judas, that he knew would do this, betrayed him and wounded him deeply. And I think the question we need to ask is, well, could Judas have been forgiven? I think he could have, but he chose not to make peace. And he went out and he hung himself, and he was his own worst enemy. But we also have someone else who betrayed Jesus, and that was Peter. But Peter came back, and they made peace, and Peter went on to do amazing ministry for the Lord. And so we have to realize there are people who will make peace and there are people who won't make peace. In our book, we have a whole chapter on how do you discern between those two different kinds of people so that you'll watch for the red flags, you'll be prepared, and you'll know what to do.
Nice girls, godly girls, real girls. When we learn to resolve conflict in healthy ways, as women, we can make a great deal of difference in God's kingdom. Let's push forward and nudge each other towards health.